Today I'll be going over 5 advanced Linux tips.
Alright, so now my first advanced Linux tip is going to be in the terminal, and that's using the tab key to autocomplete commands. So let's say I just start typing a command, so sudo apt in, and then I just use the tab key, and then it autocompletes that for me. And if there's multiple commands that would complete that, I can, for example, just start typing a package name like gnome and then hit the tab key twice. And if there's a lot of possibilities, it's going to ask you if you want to display all the possibilities. In this case, yes. And then it'll show you all the, in this case, package names that match that query. And if there's a lot that it's listing, then you'd have to hit the enter key to get it to display more, but then you just pick the one you want. But then normally it would show you the command again, and then you just keep typing what you want. For example, I'll just do -key, yeah, and then that'll narrow it down. I keep typing, there you go. And if I wanted to, I could even use that as a substitute to the ls command. Like for example, like I can do sudo nano / and then tab. Let's say I'm looking in the usr directory. Tab share / tab display all of the possibilities, and then it'll show me everything. And there you go. That's using the tab key to autocomplete commands. All right, number 4 is basic scripting, and specifically bash scripting. Basically, what this will let you do is, instead of manually typing in a set of commands one by one, a basic bash script is something that will let you do it with just one command. And of course, you can make more advanced scripts than that, but we're just going to stick to the basics. So first of all, the first line of your bash script is going to be !bin/ bash, and you can change this depending on what shell you use. Basically, this tells the interpreter what shell this is meant to run on. This is called a shebang. Okay, but now we can hit enter, and now we can start typing our commands. Like I'll just do echo commands here, which basically repeat text. So I'm just going to do echo. Here is some text. Echo. I'll even change that here. And here is some more text. Okay, there we go. Now you get a very simple bash script. So just save that. I'm just going to save it to the home folder. I'm just going to call it echo because of the command. And there you go. And this auto-detected the file type here, in this case a bash script. But anyway, we can close our text editor. And then the next step is to go into your file manager and make that file executable. Or alternatively, you could do that in terminal by doing chmod +x and then the file name. But then all you do is you put the path to the file, in this case /echo, since the home folder is our working directory and the file is in our home folder, and then you just hit enter, and then it runs our bash script. And what I essentially did was 2 commands with just one, if that makes sense. And of course, you can do a lot more with this. Like for example, what I've done is I've made a bash script that'll basically install all my applications. So that way, if I ever have to reinstall Linux after restoring from my backup, I can just run this script, and then I'm up and running in like 20 minutes. All right, number 3, back in our terminal, is help commands, specifically using help options with other commands. Like I'll give you a prime example of a command that gets used very frequently, at least in Debian land, and that is apt. What I can do is just do apt help, and then it'll show me a list of commands for apt and what they do. Now with some commands you might have to do --help or even just -h. And another thing I want to go over is if you need a more in-depth guide, you can just use the man command by just typing man and then your command to get a more comprehensive guide for how to use a command line application. And this can be really useful in crafting your own commands instead of having to rely on commands copied and pasted from the internet. So help commands are a tool that I use a lot when I'm crafting commands for a command line application that I don't know how to use. All right, number 2, configuring a Linux installation where you're going to have multiple distributions installed on a multi-boot configuration. So the most efficient way to do this is by having separate root, home, boot, and swap partitions. Now, a lot of Linux enthusiasts like to do this because it gives them a lot of control over their partitioning. But in my opinion, this is really only beneficial if you plan to install multiple Linux distributions on a single system and you want your home directory and your bootloader shared across these Linux distributions. So I'm in the Ubuntu installer. If we come to installation type, I'm going to just select something else, which will bring us to the manual partitioner. Now this is just a blank, uninitialized virtual machine disk, so I'm going to have to create a new partition table. There you go. Now we got some free space to play with. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a boot partition. I'll make this about a gig. It doesn't really need to be crazy big, but I will be generous with it, and I'd put it on the beginning of the space. Now, if you have a UEFI BIOS, you should also create an EFI system partition. And now I'm going to create about a 2 GB swap partition and then designate that as swap area. And by the way, if you're creating an EFI system partition, you would just designate that as an EFI system partition and then put it on the beginning of the space. But in my case, I want it on the end of the space. There you go. There's my swap partition. So now I got this free space to play with. So now of this space that's going to be shared between my root and my home partition, I'm going to dedicate half of that as my root partition. And then the rest of the free space, I will designate as my home partition. I can just hit OK on that, and that should fill up the rest of the space. There you go. Now we have a finished partition layout. Should look something like this. So now your boot, your root, and your home should be ext4 or whatever Linux file system you prefer. If you have a UEFI BIOS, then you'll need to create an EFI system partition and then designate that as EFI system partition. And then your swap partition, you just designate that as Linux swap space. But anyway, this looks good. So now I'm going to install now. And this is just warning me that I have no EFI system partition, but that's okay because we're running on legacy BIOS. But if you have a UEFI BIOS, then yes, you will need to create an EFI system partition. And then it'll just warn you about the formatting of the partitions. And then we just continue through the installation process as normal. All right, let's restart now. Now I've just booted into the new Ubuntu installation, and we've got our boot, home, root, and swap partitions. And of course, this is just a little bitty virtual machine drive. I'd obviously recommend something much bigger than this if you're doing a multi-boot configuration. But all you have to do when you're installing a second Linux distribution is just shrink this root partition and then create a new root partition for the other Linux distribution. But all your Linux distributions that you have installed will just need their own roots, and then they'll all share a boot, root, and swap. And the idea behind that is that all your user data is shared between your Linux distributions and also your bootloader as well. And all your Linux distributions can use the same swap space. So that does save on space. But anyway, moving on to number 1, and that's called TTY mode. So all you have to do for that is, I'll pull up my soft keyboard since this is a virtual machine, just so that way I don't go into TTY mode on my host system. All you have to do is just press Control Alt and then one of your function keys like F3, and then you'll get into a command line interface. And if you've ever used Ubuntu Server before, this will look very familiar because on Ubuntu server, you're pretty much always going to be in TTY mode, unless you've installed a desktop environment, which who really does that for Linux servers anyway? Now, if you're on a laptop, you may need to press Control-Alt-FN, F2. But anyway, we just log in with our username and password, and then we have access to the command line. And by the way, to get back to the desktop environment, just do Control-Alt F2 for Ubuntu. It'll probably be Control-Alt F1 for other Linux distributions, but now you're back at the desktop. And this is very useful for troubleshooting in case your desktop environment or your display manager isn't working for some reason. This is a good way to be able to fix the issue without having to do a full wipe and reinstall, which is a nice feature of Linux. But anyway, now it's time for the bonus one, which is how do I get that background that you see in my videos? Well, to do that, I use a command called cmatrix, which you have to install, but you can install it by running sudo apt install cmatrix. I'm using the tab to autocomplete trick. Then just hit enter, and then you just run cmatrix, like so, and there you go. So now to get exactly the way that I do it, what I first do is just do cmatrix -L, and then quit out of that just to get this font. I'm not sure exactly why that happens, but all that matters to me is it does what I want it to do. So I'm going to do cmatrix -B, and there you go.
And those were my 5 advanced Linux tips. Give it a like if you liked it, dislike if you disliked it, comment, share, subscribe, all that good stuff, and see you next time.